February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands. The sea boiled with noise. Battleships thundered offshore, their 16-inch guns vomiting fire and smoke across the black volcanic rock. Waves of landing craft surged toward the beaches, green-gray hulls packed with U.S. Marines, helmets down, rifles tight against their chests. The smell of salt, diesel, and cordite mixed into a choking haze. Corporal Henry Hank Wilson of the 5th Marine Division gripped the edge of his Higgins boat, watching the shoreline pulse under bombardment. "Looks like hell itself," someone muttered beside him. Hank didn't reply. The beach was supposed to be soft after the Navy's bombardment, but he'd heard stories. Iwo Jima wasn't like Tarawa or Saipan. The Japanese weren't waiting in the open. They were inside the island. When the ramp dropped, the world turned to chaos. Machine gun tracers ripped across the black sand, glowing like red beads. Mortar shells burst among the landing Marines, tossing men and gear into the air. The volcanic ash swallowed boots and slowed every step. There was no cover, only craters. "Get up that beach! Move!" shouted Sergeant Lang, waving them forward. Hank dove behind a sand ridge as bullets cracked overhead. A man next to him, Private Myers, screamed, clutching a leg wound. Navy corpsmen crawled out under fire, dragging the wounded back to the surf line. Then came the deeper, heavier rumble, Japanese artillery hidden in the mountains. Shells screamed from Mount Suribachi and the northern ridges. The explosions lifted the ground itself, raining shards of obsidian rock. By noon, the first wave was pinned down, burning through ammunition and nerves. Tanks bogged in the sand, their treads spinning uselessly. Every pillbox that went silent seemed to awaken again minutes later, connected to something unseen. Beneath their boots, the island was alive. Captain William Barber radioed headquarters, voice tight. "We're taking fire from everywhere. They've got tunnels running the whole damn place." And he was right. The Japanese under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had turned Iwo Jima into a fortress of concrete, steel, and cunning. Over 11 miles of tunnels connected hundreds of bunkers and hidden firing positions. Some were buried 30 feet deep, impervious to bombardment. Marines who thought they'd cleared a position often found themselves ambushed from behind, by men emerging from holes in the earth like ghosts. Days later, Hank's platoon advanced along the southern slope of Suribachi, methodically clearing bunkers one by one. They used grenades, satchel charges, anything that could reach into those dark mouths of concrete. But even after the explosions, the bunkers stayed silent, until a Japanese soldier would suddenly appear, firing from a new slit or doorway. "Jesus, they never die," muttered Lang, reloading. That's when a team from the engineers came forward, dragging something heavy, a weapon the Marines still didn't quite trust. The M2 flamethrower, 2 tanks of thickened fuel strapped to a Marine's back, a wand-like nozzle in his hands, and a spark igniter at the tip. It looked clumsy, dangerous, even suicidal. The men called it the Ronson, after the lighter, because it always lit. Private First Class Joe Marquez, a short kid from New Mexico, carried one. The others gave him space. They'd seen flamethrower operators get picked off fast. The fuel tanks made them perfect targets. Marquez crouched behind a ridge, breathing slow. "Cover me," he said. Then he rose, ran to the bunker's edge, and squeezed the trigger. A jet of liquid fire roared out, a 70-foot arc of flame that curled and rolled into the firing slit. Inside, screams rose under the hiss of burning fuel. Smoke poured out. No one mocked the flamethrower after that. The Marines pushed forward, bunker by bunker, the smell of burning oil and flesh clinging to the air. Each burst of flame turned a silent tomb into an inferno. The Japanese defenders began to fear it more than any shell or bullet, because it reached where nothing else could. That night, as the island glowed with embers and the cries of the wounded echoed from the caves, Hank sat beside Marquez. The flamethrower man's face was streaked with soot, his eyes distant. "They thought we'd never use it," he said quietly, "but down here, it's the only thing that works." He wasn't wrong. Deep underground, in the warren of tunnels beneath Iwo Jima, the Japanese waited, their faith in concrete and courage tested by fire itself. February 23, 1945. Southern slope of Mount Suribachi. The flag was going up on the summit that morning, a small speck of color against the smoke-filled sky. But down below, among the shattered bunkers and reeking craters, there was no cheering. The men of the 5th Marine Division were still fighting, crawling, and burning their way through a labyrinth that refused to die. The Marines had learned the hard way that on Iwo Jima, every silence was a trap. When a bunker stopped firing, it wasn't empty. It was waiting. The Japanese soldiers inside, covered in ash and sweat, would retreat through narrow tunnels into chambers behind the main firing points. From there they'd pop up again through hidden exits, often behind the advancing Americans. The island's defenders had orders: no suicide charges, no waste of life, make the enemy bleed for every inch. Kuribayashi's men followed that command with near-religious resolve. By the 4th day of fighting, the engineers and assault platoons had fallen into a grim rhythm. Flamethrower teams and demolition men moved together, one burning, one blasting. Hank's unit now operated like a machine. They would spot a firing slit, drop smoke grenades to blind it, then send Marquez forward. His assistant would lug the heavy tanks, keeping low. When Marquez pressed the trigger, the roar drowned out the battle. A violent hiss that turned the black sand orange and gold. The jet of fire snaked into the bunker's opening, splashing off the walls and curling down corridors. The heat hit like a furnace. The Marines could feel it even from 20 feet away, baking their faces, making their eyes water. Inside, Japanese soldiers screamed, some from pain, others from panic. A few stumbled out, clothes burning, firing wildly before collapsing. Others stayed hidden, their bodies turning to ash in the confined heat. The M2 flamethrower burned fuel thickened with napalm, a syrupy mixture that stuck to anything it touched. Once ignited, it clung to metal, rock, flesh, burning at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The smell was indescribable. "Marquez," Sergeant Lang called over the din, "hit that one, by the crater." Another stream of fire, another bunker silenced. The Marines moved in cautiously, rifles up, eyes stinging from the fumes. Hank kicked aside a melted helmet, its rim fused to the rock. "Hell of a way to go," someone whispered. They cleared another 50 yards that day, slow, brutal progress. At night, the island echoed with explosions from satchel charges sealing tunnel mouths, the dull whoomp reverberating through the volcanic soil. Still, enemy movement continued. The tunnels ran deep, connecting positions from one end of the island to the other. Captured prisoners described entire underground hospitals, command posts, and ammo stores untouched by bombardment. "You cannot bomb what you cannot see," Kuribayashi had told his officers before the invasion. And he was right, until the flamethrowers came. By the fifth day, the weapon had earned a new kind of respect. Marines who once mocked the walking torches now guarded them with their lives. "Flamers up" became a call that meant hope and terror, depending on which side of the flame you stood. Marquez had become a legend in his platoon. His steady hands, his nerve under fire, even the Japanese began recognizing him. One prisoner reportedly said, "The man with the fire, he is death." But carrying a flamethrower was a death sentence too. Each tank held about 4 gallons of fuel, just enough for a few short bursts. Once empty, the operator was vulnerable, burdened with a metal target on his back. Many didn't survive long enough to finish a second tank. That evening, as the Marines rested in a captured crater, Hank watched the horizon glow red from distant fires. The air was heavy with the stench of burning fuel and the sour tang of blood. Marquez sat apart, cleaning his nozzle, the blackened wand gleaming in the dim light. "You know," he said, not looking up, "they laughed at this thing when I trained with it. Said it was too heavy, too slow. Said no man could survive carrying it." Hank nodded. "And now?" "Now," Marquez said softly, "it's the only language they understand." Above them, thunder rolled from the naval guns. Below, the tunnels still crawled with movement. The Japanese weren't done. And the Marines knew tomorrow the flames would burn again. February 27th, 1945, central Iwo Jima, near the Motoyama airfields. The landscape was a graveyard of steel and smoke. Tanks burned like blackened hulks against the volcanic slopes. The once flat ground now looked like the surface of the moon, cratered, smoldering, and soaked with rain that turned the ash into oily mud. By the end of the first week, the Marines had realized that Iwo Jima wasn't just a battle, it was a descent into the earth itself. The Japanese weren't defending positions, they were defending a system. Hundreds of interconnected tunnels honeycombed the island, with rooms for sleeping, eating, even hospitals. Each bunker was just a doorway to something deeper. When Hank's platoon got orders to clear a suspected command post near Motoyama No. 2 airfield, they knew what it meant: darkness, close quarters, and no way out except forward. "Light 'em up," Lang ordered as they approached a jagged opening in the rock. The smell coming out was fetid: oil, mold, and death. Marquez checked his pressure gauge. "I've got 1 tank left. After that, you boys better pray they run." The entrance was barely wide enough for 2 men. They moved in slowly, Hank in front with his M1 rifle, Marquez right behind, the nozzle of his flamethrower leading the way like a serpent's tongue. Their boots crunched on gravel. Every breath echoed. The air was hot, suffocating. Inside, the walls were reinforced with timber and steel. Japanese voices murmured deeper down, low, indistinct, but close. Hank signaled for silence. Then a flash, muzzle fire erupted from the dark. The tunnel filled with gunfire and dust. Hank dropped flat as bullets ricocheted off the rock. "Now, Joe," Lang barked. Marquez stepped forward and unleashed the flame. The tunnel lit up like the inside of a furnace. Fire rolled down the corridor, washing over everything. The screams came almost instantly, short, sharp, human, then faded into a low crackle. The smell was unbearable. They waited for the fire to die before advancing again. Each step brought new horror, Burned rifles fused to the floor, melted canteens, shapes that had once been men. At a fork they found something unexpected, a map table half buried in ash. Japanese papers littered the floor, orders, sketches, lists. Hank picked one up, squinting at the characters. "Kuribayashi's handwriting," said Lieutenant Pierce, who had joined them. "This was a headquarters." Marquez exhaled, exhausted. "Headquarters or not, it's a tomb now." Suddenly, a grenade rolled from a side tunnel. "Down!" someone shouted. The blast threw Hank against the wall, ears ringing. Dust and smoke filled the air. From the shadows, 3 Japanese soldiers charged, bayonets fixed, faces blackened with soot. Marquez barely had time to turn. He triggered a short burst. The flame caught one man mid-stride, then the others. The tunnel glowed orange again. When it was over, Hank helped Marquez to his feet. His fuel gauge was empty, the tanks clanging hollow. "Out of juice," Marquez said, coughing. "Then we're out of luck," Lang muttered. They pulled back to the surface, blinking against the harsh light. Outside, a tank unit was leveling another ridge, blasting the mouths of caves with 75mm shells. A group of engineers waited nearby with fresh tanks and hoses. The rotation was endless: fire, reload, fire again. Above them, the Marines' flags now marked the captured airfields, but beneath their boots, thousands of Japanese soldiers still fought on, refusing to surrender, retreating deeper each night, waiting for the inevitable flame. That evening, as the men rested, Lieutenant Pierce recorded in his field journal, "Flamethrowers are not just weapons here. They are torches in the underworld. Every cave we burn feels like striking a match in hell itself." Hank sat beside Marquez, who stared into the dark mouth of another tunnel not yet cleared. "They built their graves down there," Marquez said quietly. "All we do is light the candles. And tomorrow there would be more candles to light." March 5, 1945. Northern Iwo Jima, near Hill 382. The Marines called it the meat grinder. Hill 382 wasn't just high ground. It was a fortress of overlapping fields of fire, hidden mortars, and tunnels that spat soldiers from every direction. Taking it meant breaking the island's spine. For the Japanese, it was the last bastion of their resistance. For the Americans, it was the edge of madness. By now, every man on the island carried the smell of fire. The air never cleared. It hung thick with smoke, grease, and death. The black sand still shimmered from heat in places, and every breeze carried the memory of something burned. Corporal Hank Wilson's platoon had been fighting without rest for almost 2 weeks. Their uniforms were stiff with salt and grime. Every man's eyes looked older, hollowed by what they'd seen underground. They advanced with grim precision, rifles ready, engineers in tow, flamethrowers at the center. The weapon that once drew ridicule now commanded respect, bordering on reverence. When Marquez stepped forward with his M2 strapped to his back, men instinctively gave him room, the way sailors give the sea its due. From a ridge ahead, Japanese machine guns erupted. The Marines hit the ground, bullets kicking black sand around them. "They're dug in again," shouted Lang. Pierce waved toward a line of caves cut into the hill's base. "Same plan. Fire and demolish." Marquez crawled forward, his assistant dragging the hose line behind him. He stopped 10 feet from the nearest cave, aimed low and pulled the trigger. A spear of fire shot out, so bright it lit the faces of the men around him. The jet plunged into the cave and bloomed like a living thing. Orange, red, and blue all at once. The flame seemed to breathe, sucking air inward, then blasting it out in a rolling surge of heat and smoke. Screams echoed from inside, followed by the pop of exploding ammunition. A Japanese soldier stumbled out, engulfed in flames, before collapsing face first into the sand. The men didn't cheer, they just watched in silence. "Seal it," Lang ordered. Engineers moved up, tossing satchel charges into the entrance. The explosion collapsed the opening, sending dust and fire belching outward. Another bunker gone. Hour by hour they repeated the ritual. Fire, blast, advance. The ground shook continuously with detonations. Each hill they took revealed more caves, more tunnels, more death. By evening, the sun was a dull orange ball behind the haze. The island's volcanic dust mixed with smoke from burning fuel, turning the sky into something unreal, like a storm that would never end. Hank sat on a pile of rubble, canteen in hand, staring at a flamethrower tank leaking fuel onto the ground. The air shimmered above it. "You ever think about what it's like for them?" he asked quietly. Marquez didn't answer right away. He was sitting a few feet away, his face grey with exhaustion. "I try not to," he said finally. "They built this place to be their coffin. We're just the ones nailing it shut." Pierce joined them, flipping through a notepad filled with casualty counts and coordinates. "We're almost through their main line," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Kuribayashi's still alive somewhere under all this. He won't surrender." "Then we burn until there's nothing left to burn," Lang muttered. That night, from the northern ridges, the entire island glowed faintly, a patchwork of burning tunnels, smoldering bunkers, and shattered terrain. The Marines joked grimly that you could navigate Iwo Jima by its firelight alone. But in the tunnels below, Japanese survivors huddled in the dark, their uniforms singed, their faces blackened. Many no longer had ammunition. Some carried grenades for suicide attacks. Others simply waited in silence. They whispered prayers into the stale air, not for victory, but for honor. One officer, writing by candlelight, noted in his diary, "The enemy's fire reaches even the heart of the earth. We cannot breathe. We cannot move. The air burns." For the Japanese defenders, the flamethrower wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of futility. No wall, no rock, no courage could stop it. As March dragged on, the Marines advanced through the last pockets of resistance, guided by that terrible light. And when at last the island fell silent, the smell of smoke and scorched earth lingered. The scent of a victory paid for in fire. But the memory of that fire would follow every man who survived Iwo Jima, long after the guns had stopped and the black sands had cooled. March 26, 1945. Northern cliffs of Iwo Jima, the final day of combat. The wind off the Pacific was sharp and bitter, carrying with it the tang of smoke and ash. The last pockets of resistance had fallen silent, but the Marines moved cautiously. Every shadow could still hold death. Beneath their boots lay the ruins of an island turned to cinder. For 36 days, Iwo Jima had burned. The battle that began with a thunderous naval bombardment now ended in whispers, footsteps over black sand, the creak of gear, the rattle of empty canteens. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers had fought to the death. Only a few hundred survived to surrender. Corporal Hank Wilson stood at the mouth of yet another cave, his rifle lowered. Inside, the air was heavy and still. The walls were glazed smooth by fire, a frozen memory of the flame that had swept through days before. The floor was littered with half-melted helmets and rifles fused to the stone. "Nothing left," muttered Sergeant Lang behind him. "Nothing but ghosts," Hank replied. Marquez stood outside the cave, helmet off, staring toward the sea. His flamethrower hung empty on his back, the tanks blackened and scarred. The weapon had done its work, too well. He hadn't fired it in 2 days, yet his hand still trembled as if the trigger were pressed. Nearby, engineers sealed the last tunnel mouths with explosives. Each detonation sent a dull echo across the island, like a drumbeat marking the end of something vast and terrible. Lieutenant Pierce approached, clipboard under his arm. "Kuribayashi's confirmed dead," he said. "They found his body last night, pistol in hand. No surrender, just like he promised." Lang nodded slowly. "Man fought like a soldier's soldier. His men too. They built a fortress under our feet and made us fight for every inch of it." Marquez didn't speak. He just kept watching the smoke rise from the northern cliffs where the last stand had burned itself out. "You think he ever thought we'd use this?" he asked finally, tapping the side of his flamethrower. Pierce shrugged. "Maybe he thought it'd scare us off." Marquez's lips tightened. Then he didn't understand Marines. Behind them, a squad raised the stars and stripes again over the ridge, smaller this time, quieter. There was no cheering, no celebration, just the sound of the flag catching the wind. The victory felt hollow, its cost written in the faces of the men who watched. Hank looked down the slope toward the beaches they'd first stormed 5 weeks ago. The landing craft still came and went, carrying supplies, wounded, and the dead. The black sand was littered with helmets, rifles, and the rusting carcasses of tanks. He remembered the first day, the chaos, the fire, the disbelief that anyone could survive this place. Now the island was theirs, but it felt less like a triumph, and more like a tomb. That night, as the men sat around a small fire, Marquez spoke softly, almost to himself. "When I pulled the trigger down there, I didn't think about what it meant. Just about surviving. But now..." He looked at his soot-blackened hands. "Now I can't stop seeing it." Hank said nothing. There was nothing to say. The silence of Iwo Jima was louder than any words. The next morning, the order came to prepare for redeployment. The island would become a base for bombers, a stepping stone to Japan itself. The Marines began to pack up their gear, the air heavy with the smell of burnt oil and salt. Before boarding the transport, Marquez walked to the edge of the cliff. The wind tugged at his uniform, and below him the ocean stretched out, endless and grey. He unclipped the fuel hose from his flamethrower, tossed it into the waves, and watched it sink beneath the surf. "Guess that's the last fire I'll ever light," he said quietly. Hank nodded, staring at the horizon. "Let's hope so." As the ships pulled away, the island faded behind them, a scar on the ocean, still smoking, still whispering. The men who left carried its memory home, etched into their minds like the heat of the flame itself. Years later, when the war was over and the world had moved on, some would speak of strategy and sacrifice, of courage and victory. But the ones who had walked those tunnels, who had smelled the burning earth and heard the screams, they remembered something different. They remembered how fire had conquered stone, how fear had turned to flame, and how, on that black volcanic island, the weapon they once mocked became the key to survival and the symbol of hell on earth.